Okay, assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. We have a very special guest for you today. We have Ms. Louisa Greve. She is the Director of Global Advocacy for the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Previously, Ms. Greve was Vice President for Programs and East Asia Director for the National Endowment for Democracy, with past experience at Special Olympics International for Cooperation, the National and Community Service, and the United Nations Development Program. I'd like for you to welcome Miss Louisa Greve to Talk to East Turkestan. How are you today?
Assalamu alaikum. How are you?
Walaikum assalam. We did have scheduled for us actually Mr. Omar Kanat, the director of UHRP, but due to unforeseen circumstances, we have Louisa Greve here, and we're basically going to be introduced to the UHRP and the explanation of what the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act is all about. There's a lot of talk about it, its ramifications. But before we start, Louisa, could you please quickly introduce yourself? Could you tell us, the Uyghur Human Rights Project is not your first rodeo, is it? With dealing with the Uyghurs.
That's right. In fact, I went to East Turkestan when I was a student. I was there in 1988. And it was new to me because I was educated in learning about China. I actually have family connections. And so my eyes were opened about how many years ago was that? 30 years ago, and became fascinated. But later on, I was working on democracy and human rights for people everywhere in Asia, and a big program for China. In fact, I was working at the National Endowment for Democracy, which has a grant program to support small NGOs working for their own rights and their own voice and for a democratic future. And so I got to know Tibetans and Uyghurs and Chinese, of course. And so in Washington and in Europe, Turkey, I got to know Uyghurs and eventually was able to start the very first grants that Uyghur groups received to do their human rights and democracy advocacy work.
Obviously, we know that the Uyghur Human Rights Bill or the Act has been passed into law in the US. It's been a month ago, or 6 weeks ago now. And we know the senators that were involved, but people don't really know the architects of this law, of this bill. And you guys were really are really the foundation of this, aren't you?
That's right. So I joined the Uyghur Human Rights Project just 2 years ago, but I did know it from the beginning. When the Uyghur American Association was looking for support, nobody in America knew who the Uyghurs were and how much they needed international solidarity to understand their situation and to help them advocate for their human rights. And so the Uyghur Human Rights Project was founded in 2004. I was at that time involved in helping understand what the objectives were and helping them write a mandate. And the mandate was to do research-based advocacy. And so that required having evidence and presenting that evidence to the world, which mostly was hearing Chinese propaganda. And the Uyghur voice was not in the international arena. And the advocacy part included actually just activating other human rights groups, but of course activating the US Congress. And so more than 10 years ago, people in Washington were bringing to the Congress the need to pass some kind of statement from the American Congress that it cared about the rights of Uyghurs. And the Congress at that time was already very active on the Tibetans crisis, right? The Dalai Lama was received by Nancy Pelosi. He received the Congressional Medal of Honor. There was a Human Rights Tibetan Policy Act. And so people in Washington, including Omar Kanat, who now leads the Uyghur Human Rights Project, at that time he didn't, were pressing the Congress. You must say something, pass a resolution, pass a law that recognizes the special situation of the Uyghurs.
Now, obviously, we don't like to talk about history. As you mentioned, the Tibetans had a law passed way before us, and the laws dealing with Hong Kong were passed very quickly. How come it took this long for the Uyghurs bill or the Uyghurs law to get it passed?
It's a really
difficult. It had to be like, was it a John Bolton book? Was it Trump? Was it because it's nearing election time? What were the reasons? Yeah.
That it finally passed? Well, the big lesson here is never give up. Omar Kanat personally remembers, visiting congressional offices. He actually got together some Uyghur students in America they wrote letters to 435 members of Congress and hand delivered them office by office. I mean, that's the good thing about living in a democracy. You can walk right into the Congress building and just knock on the door, go in and hand a letter to the receptionist, and it'll go in there. And so they literally printed out those letters to all of them several times. Of course, I'm talking about now an effort 6-8 years ago. And so our Uyghur advocates in the US, Uyghur Americans, got to know some of the staffers who cared most about China, about Tibet, and then they got to learn, they had to be educated about East Turkestan and who the Uyghurs were. And so through meeting some of the staffers, in fact, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen in 2009 held hearings and was talking about how to pass a resolution in the US Congress. And even before that, Omer Kanat and others were meeting with our friends, our Tibetan friends. For example, Kelly Curry, now Ambassador Curry, who is well known for assisting US Ambassador at the UN, Nikki Haley. And, people know the story about how she had to march in with Dolken Issa to the security office of that UN building in New York and tell them he is accredited to the Indigenous Peoples Forum and you can't just kick him out because the Chinese government controls the security office in New York. So that Kelly Curry, at that time, she'd been a Hill staffer and helped push through a lot of human rights legislation. And so we met with her and she said, the problem right now, the Tibetans were lucky. It was a different time when their act was passed in the 1990s. It was right after Tiananmen, and members of Congress obviously were just horrified at what the Chinese Communist Party and the government was capable of. But then was 9/11. And so terribly, the whole world and many members of Congress who are not focused on international affairs, they were afraid of doing anything to help Muslims. It was a very sad part of American history. So she told us, it's not the right time to try to have a whole act. You won't get co-sponsors because, in the American system, unlike the parliamentary systems that some of your listeners are familiar with, if the ruling party has a bill, it doesn't necessarily just get on the table. You have to have co-sponsors and you have to have the sponsors push them. So, for example, Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, she was a member of Congress from California. She took up the issue, and for a year and a half, 2 years, she was really pushing it. But the time wasn't right. It didn't work. Right at that time, I'm sorry to say, Americans knew about Uyghurs because some had been captured by those bounty hunters in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and they were sent to this prison camp in Guantanamo, and that was the issue. And so the timing wasn't right. But did we give up? No. So that's one lesson. Don't give up.
I was speaking to Gordon Chang the other day, and he said, a lot of these bills, whether it be the UHRP Act or whether it's taking China to the ICC, these are symbolic. Are they merely symbolic acts, or are there going to be real ramifications, tangible actions coming towards the CCP?
Yes, I'm very sad that so many people think this Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act that was made into law June 17th, so we're exactly 1 month into the enactment, that it has no effect. First of all, Magnitsky sanctions, global Magnitsky sanctions, which are designed for the worst of the worst, and they are named, of course it's symbolic, they're named to a hall of shame, the worst human rights abusers in the world. Chen Quanguo, Xinjiang Autonomous Region Party Secretary, is now on that list, along with war criminals and the people who killed Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer in Russia. So he's on that list, along, of course, with the other 3 officials. Secondly, it freezes their assets, and that doesn't mean, suppose they don't have property in America. Yes, here they are. Probably most of these police officials from Xinjiang, maybe they don't own a house in Cincinnati or maybe Vancouver, but they're frozen out of the international banking system because the sanctions don't just freeze the assets, they make it a crime for any bank to deal with any other bank dealing with their assets. So they are shut out. They become an international outcast. And why is Chen Quanguo so important, right? I'm sure your listeners know that he is a Politburo member. So in addition to being the architect of the horrors of everything that's happening to East Turkestan and before that to Tibet, he's one of the top 25 leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. That's not easy for any government to issue targeted sanctions against somebody like that. Now, that's just one aspect, is the Magnitsky sanctions. And in fact, in the law, it says within 6 months, the president shall report to the Congress and impose sanctions. And when did this happen? Less than just about 3 weeks into the passage of the law. So it had an immediate effect right there. And actually, Arslan, if you have time, I'd like to tell you about 3 other important effects of the law.
Definitely.
Okay, should I go ahead?
Yeah, this is what I want to do today. I want to get to, we've seen one tangible, real action taken by the US, which is to put sanctions on these 4 individuals, and they hit back trying to sanction US officials, which was, I believe, quite childish. Could we get into the other upcoming things that could end up happening because of this law?
Yes. So actually, I said 3 things. There's one other symbolic thing I want to mention, which is that the Congress of the United States made findings about the horrific abuses. We know the UN has hardly done anything, right? Some letters have been written by independent UN experts. Those are individuals who are usually professors or researchers somewhere in Malaysia, in Czech Republic, in Canada, wherever they are. They volunteer their time. They're not paid, and they have one research assistant that's paid for by the UN. They've gotten together on their own initiative. They can't fulfill their mandate by going and investigating what's happening in East Turkestan, of course, because China doesn't let them in. But they've, on their own initiative, written joint letters twice. Both last year and then just most recently, 50 of them, of every kind of mandate: the rights of the child, environmental rights, freedom of expression, freedom of religion or belief. All of them together jointly asked the UN Human Rights Council to take this seriously and to put on the table a debate session, which in the past the government of China has always blocked any discussion of what they're doing, except for one all-important session back in August 2018, which was the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, which got a lot of things rolling. So that finding, there's no official UN finding on any of these human rights abuses, but the Congress is now on the record. It is, the American government has confirmed that these abuses are happening. So it's an official confirmation. So those are the findings of the bill. That's at the front end of the bill. But on the action front, what's coming next is, first of all, this is not the end of Magnitsky sanctions. The government, the law says that the president must submit a report to the Congress with a list of the perpetrators.
Wow.
Now, who are the perpetrators? Is it just these 4 people?
No.
Absolutely not. In fact, the U.S. has already put on an entity list 20 police departments in the Uyghur region in East Turkestan. Every single Public Security Bureau, Gong'anbu, and the Bingtuan Gong'anbu, the Xinjiang Construction and Production Corps Police Department. So all of those are cited already under U.S. law by the Commerce Department as being responsible for gross human rights violations. So certainly we expect when the president sends this list to Congress, which is due within the next 5 months, they have 6 months from the passage of the law to send to Congress a list of the perpetrators. So the leaders of every police department and the leaders of the political committees and, of course, the administrators. So you could have a long, long list. That's right. And I would recommend anyone who's interested, please, it's called congress.gov. If you literally type in congress.gov, you'll get to a database and you type in S3471. And you'll be able to read the entire text. Thank you. But that,
yes,
and then
so this is the other law that's about to come into play.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, so this is a new one. We
Right.
talked about the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. This is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. This is something new.
Good.
Where are we at this? What sort of stage are we at here?
Good. So let me give you the number for anyone who's really taking notes. 3744. S period 3744 is how you can find out what's in the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act. And there's more to come on that if you want to go back to it. Now, this law is all about declaring that every product that's coming from the Uyghur region is tainted by a systematic government organized forced labor. And which we know is absolutely true, from Hashar to this new program of so-called poverty alleviation and labor transfer within the Uyghur region. What the law does is it prevents any company from importing any product that comes from the Uyghur region, as they say, Xinjiang. And that means that if you wanted to import clothing, we know so much cotton is produced there, or in this case, we know about hair products in this horrifying story, which we might talk about, you have to prove to the US government that there is no forced labor. And we know due diligence, as they call it in corporate world, you have to do due diligence that your environmental standards and your forced labor standards and child labor standards are all met within these big corporations. And that due diligence, of course, is impossible. So here, yes. Have you been talking about this seizure of the hair?
Yes, we have been talking about the seizure of the hair. And as you mentioned, even before that actual bill has been passed into law, we've already seen it being enacted, aren't we? Without even being passing it to law.
Right. And the thing about that law is it makes a blanket. Normally, the government has to prove that there's forced labor to stop any shipment. Well, how can they possibly do that? It's just a lot of resources. Who has the research? Of course, we've been providing information directly to the American government. And I hope that researchers in other countries, in Europe and Australia and in the Middle East, can provide that information to the government. But in this case, it's already under US law since 1930. It is illegal to import into the United States any goods that are made in whole or in part by prison labor or forced labor. And so that law was not enforced very well until President Obama had to sign into law an improvement and some regulatory changes to ensure that there was more enforcement and more staff time in the government to track it. And this is I have to say, this is not even a result of this introduction of a new bill that hasn't passed. This seizure of these hair is because it's already US law. And actually, UHRP really urges other governments. No other government in the world has such strong laws. And in the UK and some other countries, there's now finally some strong, and Canada. Canada has a bill that has not been passed yet in the Canadian Parliament to have much stronger laws so that companies are criminally liable if they import goods that have slave labor products. And, you know, about the hair, it's so horrifying. If anyone's ever been to a Holocaust museum or any of the concentration camps from the Nazi era in Europe and Poland, that's one of the things that everyone who came in, their clothes were taken, right, the piles of shoes, and their hair is taken off and sold for wigs. And can this be happening in the 21st century? So the seizure of the hair was both you know, credit to the US government for tracking it and seizing it, and also credit to, you know, and it just brings home very graphically the horrific use by the Chinese government of Uyghurs for their labor and for their body parts.
A lot of people, I had Dr. Adrian Zenz a couple of weeks ago. He read this research which he presented, got a lot of traction, and people were horrified as to what was happening. But as we Uyghurs know, this has been going on for a very long time. It just hasn't been written onto paper. But say people like Adrian Zenz are reluctant to call it a full-blown genocide.
That's right.
I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Yes, and when you had Adrian Zenz, you showed a clip when I was on Al Jazeera saying that this element of when a government or other actor tries to systematically prevent births in a specific population, that is an element of the legal definition of genocide as it exists in international law today. The easiest way to look it up is the Rome Statute, but there's also a genocide convention in the UN system. Actually, Adrian is right that we need legal analysis. I'm not a lawyer, you're not a lawyer. We desperately need, and UHRP has been trying for 3 years to ask any body of lawyers. If the UN won't do it, if the International Criminal Court, if the any constituted legal body won't do it, at least groups of lawyers, the International Commission of Jurists, even an independent panel to do the legal analysis and help us. The whole world has a responsibility to take notice of these systematic abuses that are intended to reduce a population and enslave a population and break up families, crush the culture, crush the language, crush the historic heritage, bulldoze their religious places of worship, their mosques, imprison their religious leaders, imprison their intellectual leaders. All of these things make it quite clear to people who understand the Uyghurs' situation that this is a genocidal campaign, but we don't have the legal authority to make a determination under international law. So it is past time for lawyers to take it up. And once that decision has been made, then all of the advocates can say, these are the people with knowledge and authority, they have done the analysis and they know it's true. So far, what we have is the U.S. Holocaust Museum in the United States, which specializes in remembering the Holocaust, this horror of the 20th century, and preventing future genocides. They have the Center for the Prevention of Genocide, and on March 5th, that center declared they are concerned that what the persecution of the Uyghurs is crimes against humanity, another term for the worst human rights violations under international law.
Okay. Your organization, the UHRP, as you mentioned, is based on research and evidence. This is what you try to do. I look at other places where people advocate for Syria or Yemen or the Rohingya. I mean, footage and witness testimonials and people allowed to go in, or at least they are able to at least visit refugee camps around those neighboring countries. Well, when it comes to the Uyghurs' plight, how difficult is it to do research on this matter and then present it in a way that makes it believable for, a global audience?
That's right, because access is limited. Journalists, we have to give credit to some of the journalists who work for international media outlets who took a lot of personal risks, and they persisted and they went, even though they wouldn't get much of a story. They knew it's dangerous to talk to some people because then the police will visit those people, but they went and they managed to put out some footage of their visits. They took photographs of the outside of these concentration camps and the orphanages, so-called orphanages, the camps for children. So, but even so, it's not as much. You don't have that footage in real time. You just have a building, but you have no pictures of the horrors happening. And so it's very difficult, and that's why people like Sean Jong and the international media outlets that started using satellite photography, satellite pictures. The biggest problem with this is that I think the Chinese government's propaganda outlets and some people who are ideologically, they are so suspicious of what they would call Western media that they find every reason not to believe it. Right? Haven't you heard people say, well, those satellite photos, they're made up by some intelligence agency?
Yeah, and it's very upsetting to make it especially seem real for our Muslim audience or our Muslim quote unquote brothers and sisters or Muslim majority governments, because they say, well, America for the longest time have been bombing the Muslim world back into the Stone Age. How come they suddenly want to help out these Muslims here? Surely America has an agenda. What do you say to those people?
That's right. Well, I would say if you're it's true that if you only have friends who are completely perfect in every way, then we'll all be alone forever. We have to see whether a statement by a European Parliament member or an American congressperson is motivated by true solidarity and true concern about global standards being violated, even if their own government is also violating the rules of war, or bombing innocent people, and lined up in a way that seems to just bring a lot of misery to the Muslim world or Muslim societies across the world. If we all wait until we've completely achieved our own ideals of complete adherence to all human rights standards, then we will all be silent forever. So we don't want the American politicians to be silent, when there's true evidence to back up what they're saying. But in addition, we also need, just because a government is hypocritical is no reason to then therefore punish the victims. Why should the Uyghurs be suffering if people in Turkey don't like, or people in Yemen don't like what the U.S. government is doing elsewhere? So it's really a terrible thing to let the Uyghurs suffer in silence just because of violations elsewhere in the world.
I mean, you're someone, and your team does this full time, raising the plight of the Uyghurs. How did you see COVID that affect the advocacy? From my point of view, it gave it a big boost.
Well, one thing is that people got used to tuning into shows like yours online. In Washington, where we work, there are a lot of think tanks, and there are congressional hearings, which is a big opportunity to bring out information, to bring experts together, and to put things before the public. But in a room, a very crowded event, and we had UHRP sponsored or co-sponsored or testified in congressional hearings where there might be 50, 80, 100 people in the room. But now you can get a lot more people tuning in, so at least awareness about events, because the whole world has gotten used to tuning in even if you're not there. And secondly, of course, people started to realize the Chinese government has covered up important public health data. It's not about politics. It's not about admitting that you abuse people or torture people in prison, or conducting terrible repression. It's just, is there a public health emergency or not? So I do believe people around the world realize that the Chinese government is capable of massive cover-up, and deception, and endangering people's lives and health. And so in that regard, COVID allows people to realize, maybe they said, I don't know who the Uyghurs are, it's hard to believe what the Uyghurs say, and maybe they believe it better. But maybe there's another angle that you're seeing as well, about how COVID has affected the Uyghurs' cause.
Yeah, for me, CCP oppression has gone to what I've been saying has gone to every single doorstep, whether it be the lives lost all across the world or people being hospitalized. It's because of the CCP. It's the way that they run what they call inside their borders. They decided to run the show the same way when dealing with other countries, and it's affected many, many lives, cost trillions of dollars, and people need to hold China accountable. So I've used the term "a blessing in disguise" because activists have said, look, if you guys don't stop what's happening in East Turkestan, in Tibet, in Mongolia, to what's happening to Chinese Christians, Falun Gong, other groups, it will come to your doorstep. And in a way, that's come true. It's
come true in Hong Kong, and it's come true because of the system, that the Communist Party's habit of recklessly endangering people's lives just to control information and control their power. They did not share with the world what was happening in Wuhan. They're still holding back information. And so people should be angry about the way this authoritarian system continues to endanger lives exactly everywhere in our own societies, our own cities, and our own homes. And that's why that brings home that this is a threat that doesn't stay over there. It will come to everybody.
Okay, what's the next step for you guys? What have you guys got cooking up? Are you
right?
able to mention anything for us that
Well,
that we can support you with, that people would be able to get on board with, whether it be projects on social media or fundraisers or petitions? What are you guys cooking up?
that's great. Well, I would like to mention that we're very, very happy to see that in the Parliament of the Netherlands, so in Holland, there are members of Parliament who are drafting a Uyghur Policy Act. So we want to give a lot of credit to Uyghurs who live in Holland and their friends working on that. So if you live in Holland or you have friends live in Holland, ask them to call up the office of their member of parliament and say, thank God Holland has a way to respond to this horrific violation of international standards, And then in the same way, we encourage everyone to support in Canada the passage of a law on forced labor imports. So it's modern slavery is the term, modern slavery. That law has not passed yet in the parliament and needs to. And in fact, just on Tuesday this week, please tune in. There will be a human rights subcommittee all-day hearing on the East Turkestan. And so a number of our friends, survivors of the camps, as well as advocates, including Dr. Elise Anderson, who works for UHRP right now. So tune in, pay attention, give encouragement to the government of Canada. In fact, if Uyghurs who don't even live in Canada somehow can find a way to get in touch with parliamentarians, they're human too, or they realize, wow, that a whole people all over the world are watching me. Should Canada step up and do something? So that's the Netherlands. In addition, I want everyone to keep an eye open because we know that these forced labor products, Nike was mentioned, right? Great investigative journalism by the Washington Post and the report from Australia called Uyghurs for Sale. Those brands need to feel under pressure. So there's a petition that Freedom United has. It's a little hard to find now, but if you go to Freedom United and then search in there Uyghur, that petition can still take more signatures. In addition, there's going to be, we're getting ready to put a lot more pressure on those companies, IKEA, H&M, Nike, Adidas, and so many household names and brands. And so I hope that Uyghurs who see that happening will find a way to add their voice and support this on social media and tag those companies so that they feel the pressure. And in addition, this is exactly the petition.
Yeah.
So it's
26,000.
It's 26,000. It should be more, shouldn't it? Freedom United is it says, let's end modern slavery together. And so I really think that your viewers can help boost that number. You do have to put an email address, but don't worry about it. They won't email you anymore. You can just put in, if you made a typo, it wouldn't matter. Your name, your signature will still be registered. So for people who are a little bit afraid to give their real email address, it's okay. Just put in any address. It doesn't matter. In fact, you can put in mine again. And so just look out for that next week. You'll hear some big announcements in the media. And I hope that people who want to translate it into local languages will feel free to this pressure for international companies to stop their complicity in crimes against humanity and forced labor for the Uyghurs.
Okay, last question. Come November 2020, I mean, you've dealt with the Uyghurs' plight, dealing with different governments, for decades. Is there a difference when the Democrats are in power or when the Republicans are in power? And come November 2020, who should Uyghurs be rooting for?
Interesting question. Uyghurs need to be rooting for awareness. Right. We don't control who is going to be elected. And so any human rights advocate can never count entirely on one party. And I know in some countries it seems impossible. One party will never support, let's say, Muslims, right? If it's a country with a lot of division, The mindset, however, has to be every ally is a good ally. And if one party seems to be louder, like right now, a lot of people say, well, Senator Rubio is a Republican, he's louder. But then they forget that name is easy to remember, but Senator Menendez is a Democrat. He was working, on this as well. Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, the head of the Democratic Party in our Congress, has spoken about the Uyghur crisis, and she's the one that made that vote happen, both in December and again in May, when that's a very crowded calendar. If she just wanted to be reelected, she didn't have to do it, but she did it because for leadership for this global issue. So she's a head of the Democrats, and of course, Congressman McGovern has been tireless. He's met with Omar Kanat and Rabia Kadir and many other people time and time again. We presented him with a ceremonial robe and a dopa that was sent by Uyghurs, our friends in Central Asia, and we went and presented it to him because of everything that he's done. So I guess the point is, don't root for a party, take action to make sure that every member of the European Parliament, every parliamentarian in your country, especially reach out to the minority parties, because yes, that party can turn over, and they need to know about this issue. So we root for bipartisan support, and thankfully right now that's true in the US, and we hope it's true in other countries.
It's definitely true. It definitely showed up when the Uyghur bill was passed into law, that 400-1 supported it. So definitely it's one of the rare issues in the United States where you've got the left and the right on the same page.
That's right.
Okay, guys, I would like to thank Miss Louisa Greve today. You can follow her on her Twitter. She's got it up on the screen. Make sure to follow the great work that is being done by the Uyghur Human Rights Project. You can find it here, their website. They've also got a Chinese Twitter handle. Share the work they do. Share the research that they do. In the world, in social media, when we're looking at, is it fake news or not, these guys do the background check before they post anything. And I can 99.9% guarantee that the stuff that they publish out is true. So again, I would like to thank you, Miss Louisa Greve. And I'd like to thank all the audience today for joining us.
Yes, I'd like to thank our audience and our host. You do a great service, Arslan. So hats off to you. Rahmat to everybody.
Thank you very much. Rahmat. Okay, guys. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all. Bye.